The month was May 1945. The war in Europe had ended, but its echoes clung to the air like smoke. In a Bavarian POW camp ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers, a column of German women, nurses, auxiliaries, clerks, were marched in under the watchful eyes of U.S. guards. Boots crunched on gravel, Red Cross armbands flapped in the spring breeze, and every prisoner braced for hunger, insult, and payback. What none of them expected was the faint, impossible sound drifting from the recreation hall: piano keys. Inside, an American soldier in a dusty uniform sat at a wooden upright, fingers moving over Chopin's notes as though the war had never happened. The melody carried across the yard, reaching ears trained for commands and gunfire, not music. Prisoners froze. Some blinked back tears, others exchanged wary glances. Was this a trick? They had been warned in Germany that capture meant degradation. Instead, their first impression was art. The clash between expectation and reality was almost unbearable. Statistically, they were joining a vast, invisible city of captives. By spring 1945, the United States alone held over 400,000 German POWs in camps, from Texas to Minnesota, from Maine to California. In Bavaria's temporary holding sites, smaller contingents, sometimes just hundreds, were processed before transport across the Atlantic. The scale was industrial. Yet here, amid this machinery of detention, was a man playing Chopin. One prisoner later recalled the feeling with blunt honesty. "We thought they would spit on us. Instead, they played music." It was not mercy they expected, it was revenge. The sound of piano keys undercut months, even years, of Nazi propaganda about Americans as quote, brutal barbarians. In that moment, the moral logic drilled into them collapsed under the weight of a single melody. NNTHE guards gave no explanations. Rules were rules. Prisoners filed into barracks, names checked, possessions logged. But that sound lingered, stronger than any order barked in English. It created a question that no prisoner dared say aloud. If the enemy offered music instead of punishment, what else inside these camps would defy expectation? And as night fell, the POWs tried to sleep on cots they had not expected to receive, the piano echoing in their memory. The wire around them felt less like a cage and more like a strange stage, where tomorrow would reveal the true script of captivity. And tomorrow began with their first full look inside the camp itself. The next morning, sunlight cut through the thin fog and revealed the camp in full. German women stepped cautiously across the yard, their boots tapping against concrete walkways instead of mud. What they saw overturned every expectation carried from the Reich. The barracks were not crumbling huts, but long wooden buildings lined with real mattresses, clean blankets folded at the edge. Showers hissed in tiled rooms. Soap and towels were stacked in neat piles. For captives braced for filth and punishment, this was cognitive whiplash. They noticed the mess hall first. Trays of steaming food carried past, metal spoons clinking. American rations ran heavy with bread, meat, potatoes, even coffee, luxuries their families hadn't touched in months. On average, U.S. military reports show POWs consumed around 200 calories a day, sometimes more. Back in Germany, civilians survived on barely half that, 200 to 500 calories, when supplies dwindled. The POWs whispered among themselves. Were they really being fed more as prisoners than their own children back home? NNTHE scene was not accidental. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment, but America's scale of supply turned humane into something closer to abundance. Flour sacks stamped U.S. Army stood shoulder-high in storerooms. Tins of condensed milk clattered in crates. For women who had walked through bombed German cities, past rubble where bakeries once stood, The sheer presence of food in captivity felt surreal. An enemy diaries later admitted the shock. One recalled, "We ate better as prisoners than our families back home." It was not gratitude that struck them first, but guilt, each bite of bread a reminder of starving relatives in Hamburg or Cologne. Yet hunger proved stronger than ideology. Plates were emptied, seconds sometimes offered, and even the most hardened prisoners felt their guard weaken in the face of basic nourishment. NTHE guards treated meals like routine, but for the prisoners it was theater. Each tray set down was proof that their image of the enemy was wrong. The rhythm of daily life, wake, shower, eat, began to feel less like punishment and more like disorienting normalcy. That disorientation would only deepen when they discovered the camp's most unlikely ritual: weekly piano concerts, where the very soldiers guarding them became performers. By the third evening, curiosity outweighed suspicion. A guard tapped a baton against the doorframe of the recreation hall and motioned for prisoners to enter. Inside stood rows of benches, a simple stage, and at its center, a piano polished just enough to catch the dim light bulbs overhead. The German women sat stiffly, unsure if this was indoctrination or mockery. Then the first notes filled the room, not military marches or propaganda, but Schubert. NNTHE man playing wore no tuxedo, only a rumpled U.S. Army uniform with sleeves rolled up. His fingers moved with practiced ease, shaping each phrase as if the war outside had never happened. Some prisoners leaned forward, jaws tight. Others folded arms to resist showing wonder. But the music pressed on, eroding defenses note by note. Chopin's nocturnes followed, then a ragtime interlude that pulled an awkward laugh from someone in the back. Even laughter in captivity felt dangerous, yet freeing. Reports from YMCA records confirm that instruments were supplied to over 500 American POW camps by 1945. Pianos, violins, even harmonicas were shipped alongside books and sporting gear, an effort to preserve civilization inside the wire. To Germans raised on state-orchestrated propaganda, the idea that their captors spent resources on art for prisoners seemed absurd. Why offer beauty to defeated enemies? The answer never came in words, only in melodies. One woman later admitted the contradiction. It felt surreal, enemies making art for us. Each recital blurred the boundaries of war and peace. Guards, who earlier carried rifles, now carried sheet music. Prisoners, who hours before scrubbed laundry or peeled potatoes, now sat as an audience. The rec hall transformed into neutral ground, a space where the war briefly loosened its grip. NTHE concerts were not optional for guards. They played as much for discipline as for morale. Commanders noted calmer behavior after music nights. Fewer fights, less defiance. The sound of piano keys in the barracks became a weekly rhythm, as predictable as roll call. For the prisoners, this rhythm carried them deeper into disorientation. If the enemy could offer culture instead of cruelty, what did that say about everything they had been taught? As the final notes of that first concert faded, silence filled the room heavier than applause. Then, quietly, the benches scraped, boots shuffled, and the women were led back to their barracks. The music had ended, but tomorrow, the reality of work details and labor rosters would test just how far this strange mercy extended. The morning after the concert, the women were handed work assignments. A guard read names from a clipboard while others pointed toward trucks waiting outside the wire. There were no chains, no barking dogs, just a clear list of duties. Some were sent to fields where wheat swayed in the summer wind, others to canteens and laundry rooms. The work was steady, not brutal, and always ended by sundown. For prisoners expecting forced marches and starvation, this was another rupture in expectation. Then official rules stated that POWs could be employed, but must be paid. And they were. Each day earned them 80 cents in canteen credits, enough for cigarettes, gum, or even magazines. The system was carefully logged, hours recorded, tokens distributed, and purchases tracked. For women who had carried ration cards in a collapsing Reich, the ability to shop again, even behind barbed wire, was unsettlingly normal. It blurred captivity with a strange sense of agency. Statistics reveal the scale. Over 200,000 German POWs were employed in U.S. agriculture alone, especially during harvest seasons when local manpower ran thin. Fields in the Midwest and South depended on their labor. In many cases, farmers drove them out in trucks, worked side by side under the sun, then returned them to the camp by dusk. These arrangements were not without friction, but violence was rare. Work kept camps orderly, fed American production, and gave prisoners a rhythm of life. From the German perspective, the fairness was unnerving. One prisoner later admitted, "They paid us, even when we lost the war." It was not generosity so much as law. Washington was determined to uphold Geneva standards, partly to set an example for how American POWs should be treated abroad. But for the women performing kitchen duty or harvesting corn, the nuance didn't matter. The fact remained, they were earning and spending under enemy oversight, and it felt more humane than what many of their own officers had ever offered. NNTHE's psychological impact grew in subtle ways. Earning credit to buy soap or a chocolate bar made captivity feel less like collapse and more like survival with dignity. The prisoners began to speak softly of tomorrow and next week, words of planning rather than despair. Yet the most profound shock wasn't in labor or pay. It was in what those canteen credits could unlock: access to shelves stacked with American goods, books, and ideas. And soon they would discover the camp library. When the first prisoners stepped into the camp library, silence fell heavier than in the concert hall. Rows of shelves leaned under the weight of books: English dictionaries, American novels, technical manuals, even German classics shipped in by the YMCA. For women trained to file papers or serve as auxiliaries, the sight of thousands of volumes inside a barbed wire enclosure was dizzying. A guard casually waved them inside, reminding them that checkout cards must be signed like any normal library. In many camps, collections swelled to 10,000 or more books, a staggering number considering the ruins back home where entire universities had burned. YMCA reports note that millions of volumes circulated among POWs across the world, shipped in crates marked War Prisoner Aid. For those who had last seen their schools shuttered under bombing raids, the chance to read again, freely, without censors lurking over their shoulder, felt impossible. Yet here, their captors invited them to do exactly that. NNTHE effect was immediate. Women gravitated to language texts, trying out halting English words at roll call or during work details. Others studied engineering and medicine, hoping knowledge might prepare them for a broken Germany after release. In some cases, lectures were organized. POW professors teaching fellow captives with chalk on makeshift boards, while guards simply observed. Captivity had turned into an improvised university. Enemy recollections reveal the depth of dissonance. One admitted, "We studied English under the flag we were told to hate." The irony cut deep. Nazi schools had drilled them in slogans about Anglo-decadence, yet now they pored over American literature under the stars and stripes. Each page challenged the scaffolding of ideology that had seemed unshakable only months before. NNTHE library became more than a distraction. It was a portal. Knowledge allowed prisoners to imagine futures beyond rubble and ration lines. Even women who resisted at first found themselves drawn into discussions about words, ideas, and technical charts. It was learning as survival, but also as transformation. Still, one truth lingered beneath the quiet rustle of pages. Every loaf of bread in the mess hall, every crate of books in the library, carried the same message: America had abundance to spare. And soon, the prisoners would see that abundance not just in words or calories, but in mountains of food stacked higher than they had ever witnessed. The day they were marched past the storerooms, the prisoners stopped in their tracks. Canvas flaps were pulled back to reveal towers of sacks and crates, flowers stacked to the ceiling, coffee tins glinting under bare bulbs, pyramids of canned meat that seemed endless. For women who had scavenged blackened ruins for scraps, the sight bordered on hallucination. In Germany, even a loaf of bread required ration coupons and luck. Here, in captivity, food looked infinite. NNTHE numbers told the story. By 1945, the United States was producing an overwhelming 17 million tons of food aid annually, feeding not just its military, but also allies and liberated populations. In camps across America and Europe, this abundance translated into steady meals: bread, potatoes, vegetables, butter, coffee. Some camps even served ice cream during summer months. For prisoners who remembered families surviving on watery cabbage soup, each serving was a silent demonstration of industrial might. NNTHE sensory shock was acute. The smell of coffee, rarely tasted in wartime Germany, hung in the air each morning. Bread loaves arrived warm, steam curling upward as they were sliced. Metal spoons clinked against trays heaped with potatoes. Prisoners whispered, calculating calories and comparing them to the hollow eyes of relatives back home. Their guilt was sharpened by each bite, yet hunger won. No one refused. Enemy diaries capture the turning point. One noted bluntly, "We realized why we could not win. Their supply lines never ended." The front lines had shifted thousands of miles away, yet here in a camp storeroom was the proof. The war, they saw, had been decided not just on battlefields but in factories, farms, and convoys that never seemed to stop. It was abundance as a weapon, and the prisoners felt its weight daily. NNTHE guards, indifferent, treated it as routine logistics. But for the women, it was spectacle. Every sack of flour bore a stamp, U.S. Army, bold letters across sturdy canvas. Every crate hammered shut was a reminder that their enemy's strength lay not just in tanks or planes, but in the ability to feed millions without pause. That realization gnawed at them as sharply as hunger once had. And when letters from home arrived, describing ruined kitchens, missing bread, and children faint from hunger, the contrast between camp plenty and homeland starvation became unbearable. Soon, those letters would pour in, carried by the Red Cross, connecting barbed wire comfort with rubble-stricken Germany. The mail call became the most anticipated ritual of the week. Guards handed out envelopes through a wire mesh window, each stamped with Red Cross markings and censors ink. German women pressed forward, names called one by one, fingers trembling as folded paper touched their hands. The words inside carried them across oceans, back to bombed-out homes and hollow-eyed families. And with every letter came a new weight. Guilt. NNTHE, Geneva Convention, guaranteed POWs the right to correspondence, and the system worked with startling efficiency. By 1945, millions of letters crisscrossed the globe monthly through neutral Switzerland, overseen by the International Committee of the Red Cross. For prisoners used to silence under rubble and blackout, the steady flow of mail was almost unbelievable. Even in captivity, they heard from mothers, siblings, husbands, people they feared lost forever. NNBUT, the content was brutal. Families wrote of breadlines stretching down ruined streets, of children fainting from hunger, of homes reduced to cellars. Civilians in Germany were scraping by on 200 to 1, 500 calories per day, and often less. Women in camp compared these numbers to the rations on their trays, 3,000 calories or more, and the disparity cut deep. They gained weight under enemy custody while their children wasted away. One POW remembered bluntly, "Our families starved while we gained weight." The statement carried no pride, only shame. For some, meals became a struggle, each bite swallowed with thoughts of hungry mouths in Hamburg or Dresden. Others sent home tiny tokens from their earnings, soap, chocolate, or photographs, though these gestures felt pitiful against the scale of need. NNTHE guards, pragmatic, treated mail call as routine paperwork. But for the prisoners, Each envelope was a mirror showing two worlds, one of rubble and hunger, the other of relative comfort behind wire. That mirror deepened the psychological fracture already opened by music, showers, and libraries. If captivity offered safety while freedom meant starvation, what did that say about everything they believed? And yet, amid that guilt, new cracks opened. When guards paused to let a prisoner finish reading, or quietly slipped extra writing paper into trembling hands, the contrast sharpened. Small kindnesses became more disarming than abundance itself. It wasn't just food or letters shaping them now. It was the unexpected humanity in daily gestures. It started with something almost invisible, a U.S. guard passing a cigarette through the wire when he thought no officer was looking. Another time, a baseball glove was tossed toward the women's compound, and prisoners laughed awkwardly as they fumbled with the rules of the strange American game. At a nearby farm detail, guards even allowed prisoners to pose for photographs at a wedding they had helped prepare, the snapshots later hidden inside letters home. These were not grand acts of mercy, just small human gestures, but they cut deeper than rations or rules. Official surveys decades later found that many POWs remembered such moments more vividly than any barracks routine. Cigarettes shared, a smile during roll call, a song hummed in German by a guard who had immigrant parents. These memories reshaped the captives' image of their enemy. They had expected to be despised, perhaps brutalized. Instead, they were treated with a casual respect that was almost more shocking than kindness. One German woman recalled, "It was the opposite of what we were told in Nazi school." In classrooms back home, Americans were painted as crude, cultureless, violent. Yet here, soldiers explained baseball rules patiently, or showed how to take photographs with a Kodak camera, or allowed time for a prayer in the barracks. These gestures weren't charity. They cost the guards little. But for the prisoners, they dismantled indoctrination brick by brick. NNTHE emotional impact lingered. Cigarettes smoked in silence became a form of communion. A shared laugh during a baseball fumble felt like a small act of rebellion against the invisible grip of propaganda. The women began to tell each other, quietly, that perhaps the world beyond Germany was not the dark place they had been warned about. NNFOR, the guards, it was routine. For the prisoners, it was revelation. And when the next music night arrived, the piano keys carried new weight. The concerts no longer seemed like strange theater. They felt like a bridge, each note reinforced by those small moments of unexpected humanity. NNTHE women shuffled back to the recreation hall, ready to hear music again. This time, though, they listened differently. If their captors could share food, letters, and cigarettes, what would it mean when they offered something as intimate as culture itself? While most German prisoners were men, the few thousand women captured clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, felt the shock of captivity more acutely. They had braced for the worst: harassment, degradation, perhaps even disappearance. Instead, they found themselves addressed with formal respect, handed rations equal to the men, and given quarters that were modest but safe. The dissonance was sharper because their very gender had been weaponized in propaganda, told they would be dishonored if captured. Yet here, respect was the rule. NN statistics confirmed their rarity. Out of the hundreds of thousands of German POWs held by the United States, only a small fraction were women. Sources vary, but estimates remain in the low thousands, mostly communications auxiliaries or Red Cross nurses swept up during retreats. This scarcity made their presence in camps even more visible, and guards often maintained stricter oversight to avoid scandal. The women noticed. Patrols doubled near their compounds, but the discipline meant safety, not menace. Their own testimonies revealed disbelief. One nurse recalled, "Even in defeat, we were treated as humans, not spoils." For those raised in a system where female worth was tied to service to the Reich, recognition as individuals, students, daughters, professionals, was destabilizing. Many described their captivity as the first time they were treated with both firmness and fairness by men in uniform. NNTHE experience forced comparisons. Stories trickled in of Soviet prisoners in German camps, where starvation and abuse were routine. The women whispered to each other at night, recalling what they had overheard about conditions in stalags. That contrast between what their own country had inflicted and what they now received was almost unbearable. NNTHE piano concerts hit them differently, too. Music had always been tied to memory. Dances before the war, lessons as girls, family evenings around a gramophone. To hear familiar pieces played by the enemy blurred lines between captor and companion. Each note made it harder to cling to the image of Americans as faceless monsters. And as the weeks passed, the women began to carry themselves differently, less rigid, less guarded. Respect had softened suspicion, but this shift was also dangerous, because it forced them to confront the reality of their own side's actions. Soon, direct comparisons to German-run camps would pierce even deeper, shattering the last illusions they clung to. One evening, as the women huddled near the stove in their barracks, a conversation slipped into dangerous territory. They whispered about the stalags back in Germany, the vast prisoner of war camps their own country had operated. Everyone had heard stories. Soviet soldiers crammed into open pens, no shelter, no food, death by the thousands. The contrast with their own conditions in American custody could no longer be ignored. NNTHE numbers were staggering. Historians estimate that over 3 million Soviet POWs perished under German captivity, victims of starvation, neglect, and disease. In some stalags, mortality rates reached 60% in the first year alone. Compared to that, the United States maintained strict compliance with the Geneva Convention. Food, medical care, even cultural activities were monitored and documented. For the German women now wrapped in wool blankets on clean cots, the knowledge was unbearable. Their own nation had treated others as expendable, while the enemy treated them as human. One POW summed it up with cold honesty. "We expected revenge. We found rules." That single line captured the dissonance. The women had been warned that capture meant brutality, yet they discovered paperwork, procedure, and predictable routines. Guards enforced discipline, yes, but never descended into chaos or cruelty. What they were experiencing wasn't mercy. It was order, and yet that order carried a psychological sting. Every spoonful of stew, every allowed letter, every music night served as an unspoken comparison. This is how your enemy treats you, and this is how your own country treated its prisoners. The shame settled over them heavier than any guard's gaze. NNTHE piano concerts took on a new meaning after those hushed comparisons. Notes of Mozart and Beethoven echoed not just as art, but as indictment. If their enemies could play their culture back to them with respect, what did that say about the system they had served? Music became less entertainment and more confrontation, a mirror held up by their captors. NNTHE realization spread quietly, like smoke through the barracks. It could not be spoken openly, not yet. But the foundation of belief was cracking, and the next concert would show how music itself, weaponless, wordless, could disarm anger faster than chains or rifles ever could. The next concert began like the others. Guards arranging benches, prisoners filing in with cautious steps, but the atmosphere had shifted. After whispered comparisons to German-run camps, the women listened differently. When the piano's first notes rose, the sound was no longer just background. It was confrontation and comfort entwined. Schumann floated into the rafters, filling a hall that smelled of sweat and sawdust, while the women sat motionless, absorbing something more powerful than words. NNTHE guards understood the effect. Reports noted that discipline improved after music nights. Camp commanders quietly observed that concerts reduced tension, lowered the chance of fights, and even softened the sharp edges of homesickness. Statistically, riots in U.S.-run POW camps were rare compared to those in Britain or Canada, and some officers credited cultural programs, including music, as a subtle form of control. Order through melody, NNBUT for the prisoners, the control felt different. The music disarmed anger in ways no barbed wire could. One woman later confessed, "The music killed our anger faster than chains." Listening to the same composers they had grown up with, played by men they were taught to hate, shattered the easy comfort of resentment. Hatred required distance. Music erased it. NNTHE effect was not immediate surrender. Some sat with arms crossed, refusing to clap, eyes narrowed, as if trying to rebuild mental walls. Yet others allowed themselves to hum along, a few even wiping tears quickly, so no one would see. The concerts cracked the silence of captivity in a way roll calls and work rosters never could. They created moments of shared humanity, guards and prisoners breathing the same rhythm in the same room. When the final chord struck, there was no applause, just the scraping of benches and the shuffle of boots, but the silence itself spoke volumes. In that quiet, many realized the war was already lost, not just on battlefields, but in hearts unwilling to keep hating. Not everyone yielded. In the shadows of the barracks, hardline Nazi loyalists muttered that the music was a trick, a weapon of weakness. They mocked those who swayed to the melodies, warning that the enemy's art was meant to rot their resolve. And soon, the camp would split between those softened by the piano and those clinging desperately to ideology. By late summer, the fractures inside the camp were impossible to ignore. After each piano concert, groups splintered. Some women lingered in hushed conversations about the music, while others sneered, whispering enemy tricks and spitting on the ground. The hardliners, those still wearing fragments of Nazi insignia sewn into collars or hidden in pockets, warned that even listening was betrayal. Their defiance carried the same desperation as a drowning swimmer clutching debris. NNTHE Americans noticed. Military intelligence had long monitored ideology inside camps, segregating the most fanatical prisoners into separate compounds to prevent violence. Reports confirmed that Nazi compounds existed across dozens of U.S. sites, isolating agitators from moderates. In this Bavarian holding camp, the segregation was looser, but tensions grew with every passing week, and prisoners described the pressure bluntly. One recalled, "It was harder to hate when the enemy gave us Mozart, yet yielding carried risks." Hardliners spread rumors, accused listeners of weakness, and sometimes vandalized library books or tore down YMCA posters from barracks walls. The fight wasn't physical, it was psychological, waged over what it meant to remain loyal to a collapsing Reich. NTHE contrast between groups deepened the surreal atmosphere. One day, a guard handed out canteen credits, and women queued politely to buy soap and chocolate. The next, a ringleader hissed warnings that such comforts were bait, meant to strip them of German pride. But the more they resisted, the more hollow their warnings sounded, especially as letters from home described bombed-out cities and hunger lines stretching through rubble. Reality was breaking through doctrine. NNTHE piano concerts became the front line of this invisible war. Each nocturne, each waltz was an assault on ideology, not with propaganda, but with familiarity. These were the same composers once celebrated in German living rooms, now carried through American hands. The irony was unbearable for some, liberating for others. NNS lowly, the weight shifted. Hardliners lost their grip as small cracks turned into collapses. The women who once sat with crossed arms began tapping feet, nodding quietly, even smiling when ragtime closed the night. Resistance gave way to curiosity, then acceptance. Indoctrination, once unshakable, was softening under the steady rhythm of life inside the wire, and as ideology fractured, transformation stories began to emerge. Prisoners who not only adapted, but began actively reshaping themselves, asking for English classes, and dreaming of futures far from the ruins of Germany. By autumn, the camp no longer felt like a place of endings, but of strange beginnings. Women who once muttered Nazi slogans now gathered around chalkboards, repeating English words in halting accents: table, window, bread. Guards, half amused and half proud, supplied pencils and notebooks. What began as a distraction turned into determination. Captivity had become an education. NNTHE statistics reveal how far this went. Thousands of German POWs across the U.S. enrolled in English classes, vocational training, and lectures organized by YMCA staff. After the war, more than 5,000 former POWs applied to immigrate permanently to America, citing their camp experiences as the spark. What had begun as survival quietly transformed into aspiration. Inside the Bavarian compound, similar shifts unfolded. One nurse sketched diagrams from an American medical textbook, planning to study properly if she ever reached a university again. Another borrowed novels, determined to practice English by reading aloud with friends at night. These weren't ordered activities. They were voluntary, born of a realization that the future demanded more than loyalty to a dead regime. Enemy testimonies speak with unexpected gratitude. One prisoner admitted, "We learned freedom in captivity." The paradox carried weight. Behind barbed wire, under guard towers, they discovered choices they had never been offered under the Reich. What to read, what to learn, even what to dream. Small freedoms planted themselves like seeds in soil that had once been barren. NNNOT, every woman embraced the change. Some clung to bitterness, folding ideology tighter around themselves as protection. But the tide was clear. The majority shifted, their worldviews collapsing and rebuilding in the same confined space. The sound of piano keys, the weight of English words, the taste of chocolate, they were all fragments of a new identity forming behind the wire. Yet as the transformation deepened, a shadow loomed. Letters from home reminded them of what awaited. A shattered homeland, cities reduced to rubble, families broken by war and hunger. Learning English or reading Hemingway could not change the fact that soon the wire would open. And many feared what lay beyond far more than what surrounded them now. The announcement came not with fanfare, but with clipboards and orders. Names were read aloud in the yard, luggage weighed, transport trucks lined up. Repatriation had begun. By late 1946 and into 1947, German POWs were being sent back in waves, ferried by rail and ship toward a homeland still smoldering. For the women in Bavaria, the wire that had defined their world was opening at last, and yet, instead of relief, many felt dread. NNTHE statistics paint the dilemma. Tens of thousands of German prisoners in U.S. custody delayed their release, filing requests to remain longer in camps. Some feared returning to Soviet-occupied zones, where former soldiers faced reprisals, trials, or even death. Others feared something quieter but just as heavy: the rubble, the hunger, the silence of cities that no longer resembled home. The safety of captivity, paradoxically, seemed preferable to the chaos of freedom. In barracks conversations, this fear surfaced in blunt admissions. One woman recalled, "The wire opened, but we did not want to walk through." The phrase captured a collective hesitation. They had built routines around music, work details, letters, even laughter. Now, those fragile comforts would vanish overnight, replaced by uncertainty, and NNTHE departure process underscored the contrast. Guards handed out Red Cross parcels for the journey, bread, chocolate, cigarettes, while trucks rumbled at the gates. Some women clutched books borrowed from the camp library, promising to return them, though they never would. Others tucked photographs of camp life into bags, friends laughing during baseball, snapshots of a piano on stage. Mementos of captivity carried home like contraband memories. NNFOR, the guards, it was routine paperwork, another transport completed. But for the prisoners, each step away from the camp was a step into an unknown future. Tears were not for leaving prison. They were for leaving behind the strange world where enemies had treated them with respect, where music and abundance had cracked ideology open. Nay, as the convoy rolled out, the women glanced back at the barbed wire, the guard towers, the rec hall where Chopin had played. The wire was behind them now, but the echo of piano keys followed. That echo would shape how they remembered not only their captivity, but their enemy. And years later, those memories would resurface in memoirs, interviews, and surveys, as former POWs reflected on how profoundly those experiences had altered their lives. The war ended, the camps emptied, but the memories refused to fade. Back in ruined Germany, former POWs carried with them stories that seemed almost unbelievable to neighbors. Stories of hot showers, steady meals, libraries filled with thousands of books, and piano concerts played by their captors. In a landscape of hunger and rubble, such accounts sounded like exaggerations. Yet memoirs and later surveys confirmed them again and again. In the 1950s, researchers in West Germany asked former prisoners about their time in U.S. custody. Many described those years as, quote, formative, a word almost never applied to captivity. The memories were not of humiliation, but of transformation. Some wrote openly that their first real glimpse of democracy came not in classrooms back home, but in the routines and fairness of POW camps. The paradox was clear. Freedom, in some sense, had been introduced behind barbed wire, and statistics give the reflection weight. Thousands of ex-POWs applied to immigrate to the United States after their release, some successfully building new lives there. Others became teachers, doctors, or civic leaders in Germany, citing their American captivity as the moment they realized another way of living was possible. Their recollections formed a quiet, human bridge during the Cold War, influencing how ordinary Germans viewed the U.S. long before official diplomacy could catch up. One woman summarized it starkly: "America defeated us twice, once with weapons, once with kindness." The line, repeated in interviews decades later, captured the emotional contradiction. The same army that had bombed their cities had also played Beethoven for them inside prison walls. That contradiction became the seed of reconciliation, proof that mercy and strength could coexist without canceling each other out. NNTHE piano concerts, once a surreal experience for weary prisoners, turned into the most powerful symbol in hindsight. They were remembered not as entertainment, but as revelation, the moment the enemy stopped being faceless and became human. For many, it was the first time in years that they felt part of a shared culture rather than pawns in a collapsing ideology. NNBUT reflection alone did not close the story. The piano keys that had shocked the prisoners in 1945 still lingered in memory decades later. And those echoes would find their place in the final reckoning, as women looked back on captivity and realized how it had reshaped their entire worldview. Decades later, survivors still recalled the moment as if it were yesterday. Stepping through barbed wire in May 1945 and hearing, not insults or rifle shots, but the fragile notes of a piano. That sound had haunted them longer than hunger or fear. In the middle of a world war, inside a prison camp, the unthinkable had happened. The enemy gave them music. NNTHE's story was never about comfort alone. It was about contradiction. These women had expected to be broken down by captivity, yet they were built up by routines of food, hygiene, and learning. They had expected cruelty, yet found structure. They had expected hatred, yet received gestures of humanity, small, almost casual, but devastating in their impact. The piano became the sharpest symbol of all, familiar culture mirrored back by those they were told to despise. Historians still point to the raw numbers: more than 400,000 German POWs in U.S. hands, thousands of concerts, millions of books and letters exchanged. But statistics only sketch the outline. The essence lies in memory, the way a nocturne echoing across a wooden hall could collapse ideology faster than lectures or propaganda. The war was decided by tanks and tonnage, yes, but its aftermath was shaped in quieter spaces where mercy proved stronger than rage. One former prisoner wrote later, "In captivity, we saw the world differently." It was the kind of line that could serve as confession, testimony, even warning. For these women, the camps were not just holding pens. They were crucibles where belief systems dissolved and something new took shape. For America, it was an unintended weapon. Abundance and dignity wielded more power than any guard tower. NNTHE final takeaway lingers, like a last chord struck on that battered upright piano. Empires fall, cities burn, ideologies collapse, but sometimes the most enduring victories are scored not by bullets, but by kindness delivered at the right moment. And for those German women, the memory of that sound, piano keys rising above barbed wire, remained a reminder that humanity could survive even the darkest war.